September 1944. Somewhere in the American South. The train slows before it stops. Steel wheels shriek, then fall silent. For days, the men inside the boxcars have measured time by darkness and motion. Now there is only stillness. A door slides open. Light pours in. Warm air follows. The first thing they smell is food. Not the thin, gray substitute bread they remember from home. Not turnip soup or Ersatz coffee. This smell is dense, oily, real. Meat, bread, coffee brewed from actual beans. It drifts across the platform, carried from a nearby mess hall where American soldiers are already lining up. German prisoners step down onto gravel. They expect shouting, beatings, retribution. Instead, there are forms to sign. Directions given in plain voices. Armed guards, yes, but relaxed, almost indifferent. Ahead, long wooden barracks stand in neat rows. Clean. Painted. Inside, bunks with mattresses. Blankets folded, not thrown. And waiting at the center of it all, metal trays stacked beside steaming vats. The men exchange looks. No one speaks. Because in that moment, standing hungry and exhausted on American soil, a question begins to form, one that will follow them long after the first meal is finished. What kind of enemy feeds you like this? And the answer begins far from this camp, in a world already shaped by war. By 1944, the German soldier no longer lived in a world of confidence. He lived in a world of shortage. At home, the Reich was tightening like a clenched fist. Food ration cards had been part of daily life since the early years of the war, but now even those guarantees were hollow. Meat was rare. Butter nearly gone. Bread stretched with fillers, potato flour, sawdust rumors whispered but never confirmed. Civilians queued for hours for meals that barely met survival. Cities lay under nightly bombardment. Rail lines were severed. Farms were short of labor. Hunger was no longer temporary. It was structural. At the front, conditions were worse. On the Eastern Front, entire German armies had vanished into snow and smoke. Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was a warning that abundance no longer belonged to Germany. Units were undersupplied, underfed, and increasingly immobile. Soldiers scavenged from abandoned villages. Field kitchens struggled to keep pace with retreating lines. A hot meal became a memory, not an expectation. In the West, the situation was no longer stable either. After the Normandy landings in June 1944, German formations were crushed not only by firepower, but by volume. American and British forces replaced losses quickly. Vehicles appeared in numbers the Germans could not match. Ammunition seemed endless. Fuel flowed where German tanks sat idle for lack of it. Yet even as material reality collapsed, ideology tried to hold. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a nation of excess without discipline. Soft, decadent, unserious. German soldiers were told that American industry produced quantity, not quality. That American soldiers were dependent on comfort. That captivity under such an enemy would be humiliating, or brutal in its own careless way. There was also fear. The German army knew the Geneva Convention. It had signed it. It expected others to follow it, at least in theory. But war had eroded trust. On the Eastern Front, surrender often meant death. Stories traveled fast. Rumors hardened into belief. Many German soldiers assumed captivity anywhere would involve hunger, disease, and revenge, especially against an enemy with the resources to punish. As American forces pushed deeper into France and toward the German border, capture became unavoidable for tens of thousands. Entire units surrendered intact. Others were surrounded, exhausted, and out of ammunition. Men who had expected to die for the Reich instead laid down their weapons. What they carried with them was not just fatigue, but expectation. Expectation shaped by years of scarcity. Expectation shaped by propaganda. Expectation shaped by fear of what abundance might allow an enemy to do. And when those prisoners were loaded onto ships and trains, bound not for nearby camps, but for a continent away, they believed the worst was yet to come. They did not yet understand that the war they were entering as prisoners was being fought under entirely different rules. And that difference began not with guards or barbed wire, but with logistics on a scale Germany had never truly grasped. By the time German prisoners began arriving in large numbers on American soil in 1944, the United States was no longer preparing for war. It was operating at full industrial velocity. Across the country, factories ran day and night. Steel, aluminum, rubber, grain, and fuel flowed through a logistics system measured not in scarcity, but in surplus. American agriculture alone produced more food than the nation could consume. Rail networks stretched unbroken from coast to coast. Ports unloaded cargo faster than Axis planners had believed possible. What Germany struggled to ration, the United States managed in excess. This abundance shaped everything, including captivity. From the beginning of American involvement in the war, the U.S. government made a deliberate decision. Enemy prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Convention of 1929. Not as an act of charity, but as policy. The War Department understood that reciprocal treatment of American prisoners depended on it. Just as importantly, it understood that America could afford it. By mid-1944, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war were held by the United States. Eventually, that number would exceed 370,000 on American soil alone, housed in over 500 camps spread across the country. These camps were not hidden. Many were located near small towns, farms, and rail hubs, from Texas to Arizona, from the Midwest to the Deep South. The system was methodical. Upon capture, German soldiers were processed in Europe, then transported by ship across the Atlantic. They were fed regularly during the voyage. Medical inspections were routine. Red Cross representatives were allowed access. When they arrived in ports like New York or Norfolk, they were moved inland by train, often through landscapes untouched by war. For many prisoners, the journey itself was disorienting. There were no ruins, no burned-out stations, no bomb craters beside the tracks. Towns passed by intact, farms green and working, silos full, a visual contradiction to everything they had been told. Inside the camps, the structure was standardized. Wooden barracks, latrines with running water, medical facilities, recreation areas, libraries stocked with German-language books, religious services permitted, officers separated according to rank, as required by convention. But nothing struck the prisoners as powerfully as the food. American policy required that POWs receive the same rations as U.S. troops stationed in the camps. This was not symbolic. It was enforced. Meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, sugar, items that had become luxuries in Germany were served daily. Calories were counted not to limit intake, but to ensure adequacy. The supply chain behind this was immense. Food came from American farms that had been mechanized long before the war. Labor shortages were filled by women, migrants, and later, by POW labor itself. Grain moved by rail in volumes Germany could not match even at its peak. Refrigeration preserved meat. Packaging standardized portions. Waste was minimal. Resupply was predictable. To German prisoners, this consistency was unsettling. They had expected cruelty or neglect. What they encountered instead was routine. A system so large and confident it did not need to prove anything. Guards who enforced rules, but did not improvise punishment. Kitchens that served meals on schedule, regardless of who stood in line. This was not generosity driven by emotion. The turning point did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly over time. By late autumn of 1944, the camps had settled into routine. Days were measured not by alarms or artillery, but by schedules pinned to notice boards. Wake up. Roll call. Breakfast. Work details. Lunch. Recreation. Dinner. Lights out. The predictability itself became a kind of pressure, because it left no room for denial. German prisoners began to understand that this was not temporary theater. Red Cross inspections came and went. Reports matched reality. Supplies did not vanish after visits. Portions did not shrink. Guards did not change their behavior. The camps did not harden. Winter approached, and instead of exposure, there were heavier blankets, repaired roofs, heating systems checked and maintained. For officers especially, the realization was destabilizing. They compared notes. They tracked time. They watched for the inevitable downturn that never came. Some had assumed that food quality would decline as the war intensified. Others believed harsher treatment would follow an American defeat or provocation. Neither happened. Instead, the system absorbed everything. Even labor programs reinforced the point. POWs assigned to farms or maintenance details were paid small wages, as permitted under the Geneva Convention. They worked in fields that were full, barns stocked, machinery abundant. The scale of American agriculture was impossible to ignore. These were not carefully curated showcases. They were everyday operations. The contrast with Germany grew sharper by the week. News filtered in, through newspapers, through guarded conversations, through rumors confirmed by repetition. Cities destroyed. Transportation shattered. Civilians hungry. The Reich calling older men and boys to the front. And here, on the other side of the ocean, the enemy fed them steadily and asked them to work in order, not desperation. The realization formed slowly, but once formed, it could not be undone. If this was what American capacity looked like at the edges, then what must it look like at the center? And if this enemy could sustain war and restraint simultaneously, then the outcome of the conflict was no longer a question of courage or sacrifice. It was a question of mathematics. And the numbers no longer favored Germany. That understanding spread quietly through the camps, altering conversations, changing posture, softening certainty. And with it came something more dangerous than despair. Clarity. Once clarity sets in, belief does not collapse all at once. It fractures. By early 1945, the German prisoners in American camps were no longer debating whether the conditions were real. That question had been answered by time itself. The debate now was what those conditions meant. For years, they had been told that American strength was superficial, dependent on comfort, vulnerable to strain. Yet months of captivity had shown the opposite. Comfort was not a weakness here. It was a byproduct of organization. And organization endured. Conversations changed tone. In barracks after lights out, prisoners spoke less about victory and more about survival beyond the war. Officers who had once enforced ideological conformity found themselves isolated. Younger soldiers questioned openly. The Reich's promises sounded distant, abstract, detached from lived experience. The psychological break did not come from humiliation. It came from contradiction. Every morning roll call reinforced it. Every meal tray repeated it. Every inspection confirmed it. The enemy was not improvising. It was not compensating. It was functioning. Red Cross officials continued to document conditions. Their reports circulated quietly among prisoners, removing the last excuse for disbelief. These were neutral observers. Their presence stripped away the idea that this was a carefully staged illusion. The effect was cumulative and irreversible. Some prisoners began to imagine returning to a Germany that no longer existed. Others feared it. Many simply felt suspended between worlds, no longer believing in the war they had fought, but not yet able to envision peace. And beneath all of it was a deeper recognition. If America could treat its enemies this way during war, feed them, house them, administer their lives without cruelty, then the moral framework of the conflict was not what Nazi ideology had claimed. This realization did not make the prisoners loyal to the United States. It made them honest with themselves. The war, as they had understood it, was over. Not officially. Not yet. But internally. And once that internal war ended, what followed was not resistance, but waiting. Waiting for the collapse they now knew was inevitable. Waiting for the trains that would one day carry them back across the ocean. Waiting to face a world reshaped by a power they had finally, fully recognized. And as that recognition settled, its consequences began to extend beyond the wire. With belief broken, routine took on a different weight. By the spring of 1945, American POW camps no longer felt like temporary holding sites. They functioned as stable, long-duration environments. For the German prisoners, this stability was both reassuring and unsettling. The war outside continued to rage, but inside the wire, life followed an orderly rhythm that felt increasingly detached from the chaos they had known. Work details expanded. Under Geneva Convention rules, enlisted prisoners could be assigned to non-military labor. Across the United States, German POWs worked on farms, in canneries, lumber operations, road maintenance, and warehouse loading. Guarded lightly, often transported daily from camp to job sites, many encountered American civilians for the first time. These encounters were quiet, unspectacular, and transformative. Farmers treated them as laborers, not enemies. They worked long days, returned to camp, and were fed. Wages were credited to camp accounts. With that money, prisoners could buy extra food, toiletries, or writing materials at camp canteens. The system reinforced itself. Labor fed logistics. Logistics fed stability. Education followed. Camps established libraries stocked with German literature, technical manuals, and newspapers. Some offered classes, math, languages, engineering fundamentals. Religious services were permitted. Musical groups formed. Theater productions were staged using improvised sets. These were not indulgences. They were methods of management designed to occupy time and reduce unrest. Yet they had unintended consequences. Exposure to uncensored news, even limited, allowed prisoners to piece together the war's trajectory. The fall of cities. The collapse of fronts. The advance of Allied armies. Each report aligned with what they had already inferred from the structure around them. Morale shifted again, not upward or downward, but inward. The camps became spaces of reflection. Men thought about home, about responsibility, about the future. For some, guilt surfaced. For others, relief. For many, confusion. The ideology that had once filled every hour now had nothing to do. The American system did not demand loyalty. It did not require confession. It simply continued to function. And in that functioning, it quietly prepared the prisoners for a post-war world, whether intentionally or not. But the true impact of this experience would not be fully understood until the wire came down, and the prisoners carried these memories back to a shattered Germany. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the camps did not dissolve overnight. German prisoners remained in American custody for months, some for more than a year, as Europe struggled to absorb millions of displaced men. During that time, the routine held. Food remained steady. Work continued. Discipline stayed procedural. There was no final tightening, no punitive shift to mark victory. That absence mattered. Repatriation began gradually. Prisoners were transported back across the Atlantic, not to a restored homeland, but to ruins. Cities flattened. Infrastructure shattered.